Walk slow and I'll catch up. Let's hear the stars do their talking. Let's put all these words.
All right, so today we're talking about evidence-based practice and some of the problems with research, some of the things we like about it, some of the things we don't, like how research could be a little bit better. I've got a bunch of articles about that on the blog, so I'll try not to repeat myself and kind of write about those things. But I think while we probably have different experiences with kind of the Institute of Research, and like the way that affects clinical psychology, which is our expertise is just going to be around psychology generally. Um, we all kind of feel that the scientific method is good. Studying cause and effect is a helpful thing to do. But there are places where the incentive structure around research is not terribly scientific. Because if you look at incentive structures, one of the things that they do is that they reward you or punish you. And most people tend to follow those incentive structures. So if the incentive structures are, even if the rules are going a certain way, if the incentives are pushing people in one direction, I think it's likely that most people are going to do that thing. One of the things that I've written about a lot is that for a while, and I think that this is moving in a better direction than even 5 years ago when Taproot opened, is that clinical psychology and academic psychology, research psychology, were kind of going in two different directions. And one of those reasons is that clinical psychology is more likely to follow the market, what people will pay for, and then also what works in a sort of like clinical and embodied way, because you're in the room with somebody and you got to get them better. Whereas academic psychology is going to kind of cling to the biomedical model and try and make everything, even maybe things that we shouldn't, be very objective and empirical, and turn them kind of into a number in a way that I would argue that a soft science like psychiatry or psychology, you probably can't. Like a lot of the things that I critique are probably true if you want to study like a vaccine or cancer research, or like, which one of the antidepressants makes this pill smaller, which kind of radiation makes the tumor or not pill, germs less, which kind of like, radiation makes the tumor smaller. Those are kind of like if this, then that types of knowing, in a way that I don't know that psychology works that way. I think that it should be more centered on kind of the study of consciousness, and not just what somebody comes into a room saying, like, I want to change, but kind of like, who are you? What are you? How deep is that? It's a deeper way of knowing the self. And I think that the biomedical model has kind of lost that. So I'll go ahead and let James start his thing. If you have questions or anything about any of this, please feel free to email James and let him know. Maybe you're listening to this and you want to say, oh, that was great, except it wasn't. I didn't like any of it. And let me tell you what I learned in my clinical psychology 101 class. Please email James that. Maybe Nancy Pelosi put a penny backwards at your McDonald's for you to find. James would be a great person to email about that happening to you. All those emails that normally I get, he's going to be.
I'll fill them. It's okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, I'm going to start off. Anybody do that hack in college where you ran into a paywall with any type of article or anything like that, doing research? You're like, crap, my university or academic setting, like, does it pay for that subscription to that journal? And so you're like, how do I get around it? You just you skirt by just reading the abstract and using that as kind of your reference point and still referencing. I did that in undergrad a good bit. It took me till like graduate school to kind of say, oh, I need to have access to these full articles.
Wow.
And
that's okay. For me, I certainly had access to the robust research in my undergrad and through grad school, and was required to pull like the whole article, and we had access to all the massive databases, but you have to be a person who's going to the institute. The catch here is that you have to be a person who's going to the institution or like working there in order to be able to access this stuff. Like you can't get a membership at a like an educational institution library. Like if I call like our local colleges in town or whatever, you can't get a membership at those institutions. So you could go to like University of Alabama at Birmingham and go into their library physically and sit there and like and go through, but you can't, there's no other way to do it besides to access all that stuff through these subscriptions that cost these institutions thousands and thousands. I mean, I don't know how much they pay for all this stuff,
A lot.
but yeah,
And it's like
but
$600
nobody
a
else.
quarter, isn't it?
But
Like,
then how much you said?
I think that it's like $600 a quarter for an individual, and then organizations get a break, but it's a chunk.
Yeah. And then we have this thing of like the average, everyone in the peanut gallery is suddenly aware of something called peer review, and that we need to be using robust sources and but they don't have you have to have gone through like a background of science to even understand like what we're talking about when we're talking about peer review, what we're talking about when we're talking about robust research. It's not just like I don't know, WebMD like page, or there's plenty of like research that you can find via Google that's not like peer reviewed research. It might look like research, or it calls itself research, and people like kind of reference these things, but in reality, like there's this huge gatekeeping thing that happens where most people are not allowed to not given access to whatever the cusp of science is giving us. It has to be filtered through other people's sources, like people who might write books on this stuff, or reporters who don't have the academic background to understand what they're reading in terms of research. So, we're getting the average person is getting the news of like what science is doing through the public media. The public media has not gone to school and trained in how to read these things, because it's complicated. Like what needs to be there, what constitutes a good study, when do you need like a participant, level at certain, when does it need to be thousands of people? When is it appropriate for it to be 15 people? Because there's all kinds of ways of doing research that are like statistically sound, but there's so much knowledge that has to go into that, and in order to like be able to interpret it. And so we have people who work at, all of these very respected institutions, like like the New York Times or anything like that, but even the best, like most expert people in there are not like at the pinnacle of whatever the the newest like physics research. Like people in that field barely understand it at that outset, much less like the person who's trying to report on it, who like has to catch on that there even is something so groundbreaking, and then tries to report on it from like nobody understands it yet. And so same with and with psychology, that's kind of what we get. And so it's like these practices, like when I started my practice back in started practicing in 2010 or something, it was like EMDR was like that was like woo woo, like nobody did it. But then in graduate school, we were learning like that had to be an extra thing that you trained in. But in my education, I was turned on to that as being like, oh my gosh, this is huge. But that's 15 years ago, and it had been around for a few years before that. So it feels like everybody's just now catching on to like EMDR as being this thing, and now those of us who've been, and now like for me, I'm like, okay, no, but like brain spotting, let's divert and kind of like move this. But people are just catching on to like EMDR being kind of a standard model of care, even though the vet has been saying it's like the first, the best treatment of trauma that there is for years and years. Like the public is just now catching on. So there's just this lag. I just talked a lot, sorry.
Two of those points are really important, Alice, and one of them is the bigger the study, the bigger the readership is going to be the press, and the press is not really trained to read science. So one of the things that they're likely to do is take something that has a political implication or kind of a not controversial but exciting social implication, and then take the whole study out of context and then write one long paper about a little clip from research. And I think, as the first point you're talking about, that feedback loop is part of what makes people not trust science and feel manipulated. And also the press seem kind of slimy or controversial because, if you look at the people that are researching these huge drugs that a ton of people are on, if they start saying, hey, it looks like this drug doesn't work very good, your doctor gave you the wrong thing or something at a national level, they're
Right.
aware of the implications of that. And so they're more
Mhm.
likely to kind of try and change science, which I don't think you should do, in order to soften the impact of that. And then when people read it, I think they feel manipulated. They feel kind of messed with. I mean, you see some of that kind of happening around COVID with Fauci and the things like Obama were saying, where, I mean, it was a good idea to wear masks, but at first, like they were worried about a surplus of like there weren't enough there weren't enough equipment, so they kind of downplayed how much non-professionals needed masks, and then had to walk it back. And I think if they had just said, "Hey, masks are a good thing, but don't panic. Please leave some for the healthcare workers," and then later as supply comes back, or they were too much kind of dual intentioning there, and you see that feedback loop of the press being afraid of how the study is going to be received, or the scientists are afraid of how the press is going to receive the study. They start to change kind of the wording or the way that it's released, or control information, and then the people feel kind of messed with.
Yeah.
And then
Well,
like what
oh yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead there. Or is that kind of what you're saying? Because that's what I hear from academics.
Yeah, totally. I'm totally vibing. And yeah, and I think you're getting at, it's like the other huge part of what I'm talking about is that where does the money come from? Because the
Yeah.
research follows the money.
Mhm.
Like,
Yes.
and where does that come from? And so all the best research is from these like really great institutions. Like I went to the University of Colorado, there's tons of great research, but where does the money come from? When I was there, it was like Coors, and then who owns Coors, and like go on up. And that
Mhm.
dictates like what is like being studied, like what might benefit what parties. And if you're going to do a PhD, like people who've done done Hailey, you have to like what you want. You can't just say, oh, I hear people just throw away all the time saying, oh, if I went back to school, I would want to do this, study this thing. And it's always kind of funny to me because that's not remotely how it works. You can have like the most brilliant idea, but you have to find a very specific other professor who's being funded to do related research, and then get that person to agree to do that study with you, which is probably not going to do because it's not like a publicly, it doesn't follow like the money of big pharmacy. That's kind of what I'm talking about. But I mean, a big part of what I'm talking about. But
one, and I think there's to that point, Alice, like I think that there is a perception that like Pfizer goes and writes a check because they make this antidepressant and they like want people to prove that it works, like in the same way that like the cigarette companies put a bunch of money into like trying to prove that cigarettes like didn't cause cancer. There was some confusion about it like in the 70s and the 80s. And sometimes that happens, and that you've got these huge organizations, but I think the majority of the corporate influence isn't even like, we're paying for this study, so cloak and dagger, like we want you to go find this outcome. It's that because a lot of times what pays for this is the taxpayer, like it's socialized research. But the problem is like a lot of that research is just given to these private corporations to go do things with. Like if I pay for something as a taxpayer, I want to own it. If I pay for something, I want it. But when you give Pfizer, when you give these specific like companies money, and then they go invent a drug, they own the rights to that drug, even though they didn't pay for the research to
Right.
get it. So, I think a lot of the thing that that is kind of more at issue than the kind of secret influence in the back room. It's this kind of like weird crony capitalism of like, yeah, the taxpayer will make the thing, but then you can charge whatever you want, and then we'll try and buy it back and subsidize insurance to try and get some of the thing. And it's like, whoa. Like we invented the drug, like we gave you the money, you invented the drug with our money. Why are you the one that now owns the drug? But that's been the arrangement for a while, and that colors the way that a lot of at least psychopharm research functions.
yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to just add. So I have my doctorate from the University of Alabama and have seen a lot of this up close. And there are a lot of ethical dilemmas and issues that you run into, particularly around publishing, even from a student or academic side. The model is so very capitalistic driven. But what's interesting to me about that is, these organizations that warehouse all of these journals and the ones that you're subscribing to or paying for, either your university does, and then you get access as a student, or maybe you work for a large company and they do research and sometimes they have access, but for the most part, it's not access for everyday people. And then even if you can get access, it's hard to understand or to read. Even someone who's academically trained, there's so many articles and I'm like, I don't understand what this is saying or what it's doing. A lot of times too, articles aren't always written well. I think, there's this assumption, well, you're published, it's peer reviewed, so it's a really good article. It's not the case. Peer review is literally 2 volunteers who are academics who don't get paid to do this. We're just expected as academics to peer review. We peer review each other's articles blindly. We don't know who does it. And it's almost without a doubt, you will get a peer review publication back and they will have 2 complete opposite perspectives and opinions. So as the writer, you're like, how do I satisfy these 2 opinions, but still keep the integrity of my work? So a lot of times papers get stripped down because it's not going to get published if you don't. And so the academic structure of that is, again, capitalistic in nature, where you as an academic are required, if you're wanting to be tenure track, you're required to publish, but you do not get paid to publish. You do not get paid to peer review, but you are required to do those things. And depending on the institution, top tier institutions expect 3 to 4 publications a year for a total of 15 to 20 publications at the 5-year mark when you go up for tenure. So that leaves a lot of space where people are having to churn out these articles because they're also teaching, they're also on committees, they're also doing they might have a life outside of this. Like there's so many other things going on, but it becomes the driving factor because that's what drives kind of this capitalistic model for this for these publications. And then the databases are the ones that have all the funding.
And to your point, Hailey, the quality of a journal is determined by something called impact factor, for those not familiar, which is kind of what the readership and citation count is, how many people are reading this and counting it. So in psychology, the way that some of this stuff functions a little bit different. And then also a lot of times your pay or the quality of your work is viewed through something called an H index, which is how many people are reading articles that you wrote and then citing those articles in their research, which doesn't on its face sound like a bad system. But when you take all of the qualitative variables and you only leave quantitative variables out of the incentive structures of these institutions about who gets promoted, who gets paid the most, who gets hired, which we've kind of done as we've turned these public colleges into private corporations, and we quit paying professors. They're not getting the money. It certainly costs a whole lot more. If you look at where that money's going, it's administration. They basically have these boards of CEOs now. But like what happens is that you could open a research journal in psychology from the 70s, even from the 80s, and there would be clinical techniques that somebody noticed. Hey, if you're doing Ericksonian hypnosis, if you want somebody to go into trance state, you should maybe look at opposites, like to remind them of both parts of self or multiplicity. Start off by saying, you can be a good mother and you can be tired. You can be, you can love your children and you can be angry. Somebody would publish a paper saying that, opposites or antonyms are a good way to start trance state, something that you could use in the room. If you open an academic journal now that's a high impact factor, you look at the people that have a high H index, they're like writing stuff the way you write a website when you want Google to see it. That's garbage. Like you do a ton of information, you do a giant meta-analysis, you cite a billion things, and you're like, hey, when you go back and you control for competence and 3 other variables, you can extrapolate across like these 17 studies because you want to cite everything because you want everybody to have to cite you. And it's kind of turned research into this thing that is career making, but like is not useful, which is the point of what science is supposed to be. And so when Hailey, you're talking about like the way that people are basically incentivized when they love this stuff and they go in to do science to write in a way that isn't helping anybody do clinical psychology better, which I think is a sad place for us to have disconnected those things so much. I don't know. And James, you have some experience with that in the hospital too.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I had I have a buddy, Dr. Burke. He's a pharmacist at an organization. He wouldn't mind me talking about this, but he let me be a part of just a write-up, just a case study write-up recently, well, about 2 years ago, and saw this process firsthand. That, I mean, we saw something that worked in the hospital, and we're like, we researched it. Did has this happened before? Can we use this again? Can we replicate it? And all these things, which turned into a case study. But after said and done, we reviewed it ourselves, submit it to a couple of journals. Journals decline. One picks us up. It's just like, yeah, the reviewing starts. So you get like these red marks on your page. You get, and this is recent because I was like, this is a 3-page just case study. This is the simplest thing to write. Why are people, dictating about what we put in here? Anyway, this 3 to 4 pages, I forgot what it ended up being, cost us about $4,800 so we went the route of basically open access, which is, kind of where universities and big establishments can actually obtain this case report without having to, behind a paywall, except they were part of an organization that's probably paying for it. Open access just means that if someone's paying for a subscription to these journals, you're going to pull it up, if you work at UAB, things like that. Something that you probably couldn't pull up if you're just a layperson. Again, going back to people who actually are inquisitive and want to know these things about different niche things, which is a story I'll get to in a second about sleep psychology. Anyway, so I felt guilty. I mean, I remember there's an email chain of like some of the professors, the doctors, and Brad Burke were just like, how are we going to settle this? How are we going to settle all of this money? Like we got to pay $4,800 just to get this little thing published. And I felt guilty. I was like, oh my gosh, this is, so small. And you start thinking about that. Like if you're out there and you have something that is like not necessarily groundbreaking, but can be utilized and you need more people to kind of see, one, do you have access to that type of money just willy-nilly to send your paper? The review process went really well and they're like, okay, we're accepting it. You just have to pay this money and that's it. Like the holdup is you paying this money. I'm thinking if I was just by myself and not in this institution, and this was not that, I mean, the institution wasn't paying for it. This was actually going to come out of these doctors' pockets and things like that. So if you're your own person and you're still, you're a therapist and you discover these things, just like these old journals back in the day of somebody actually doing the work and seeing some progress, are you going to pay? That's the open access type where you do have to pay up front because again, the company is losing money every time somebody's just getting a free article, which is the hack that I kind of got around in grad school, which is if I found, I was looking up sleep psychology stuff, doing a lot of sleep psychology, doing all these things, and it's a lot of weird stuff out there, but I would get articles that I could not have access to. And I went to University of Alabama, and these databases didn't have access to these articles, which is wild. And they were great and interesting articles. I would read the abstract and like, I really need it. My buddy, who's a astrophysicist, was just like, just email the writers. And so what I would do is I would just email the writers on that, find the organization that they were at and when they wrote it, and email the writers of those articles. And I would have them, they would just email me back the PDF of their article, which is what, big journals don't want you to hear, is that, some of these, because again, a lot of people who are very excited about their work don't really, they're not going to make money off of it unless it's like something big. And so they're just like, yeah, if it's useful for you, do it. And I had a lot of great responses. What I emailed about 10 people and got about, I think out of those 10, about 7 people responded with their articles, which like, here, please. Because I would explain is like, hey, I cannot get this. I'm, at University of Alabama. I'm not able to access this. Is there a way you could help me out? And they're like, hell yeah. They're like, please. But that was crazy that I had to do that on my own and didn't have access to that. But just imagine if that's one thing that you can do is kind of look at those writers and see if they'd be willing to, give you their stuff now. But
why even like have to do that? I mean, that's the question that, since it used to be that, like if you look at like EBSCO, which is a giant academic library, they started as a magazine company in Birmingham. They sold magazines, and part
Yeah,
of
I'm
those
fascinated
magazines
by
were,
this.
but you used to have a printing press and all of these things,
Mhm.
and there was some sort of cost proposition for academic
Mhm.
libraries. And a ton of what you're talking about is, to pay for access for those academic libraries. That, I mean, so for me to go out and just get it, like if I paid for you guys to have academic access through Taproot to all of it, through like PsycInfo, one of the big ones, like it would be $600 every quarter,
Yeah.
And is
times
that
each one of
just for
these.
PsycInfo?
No, that would
Like, or
be
would
one
that
of the
be like
ones that has like
PsycInfo,
a,
Medline,
no, like EBSCO.
EBSCO like,
EBSCO is what I
Mhm.
priced basically. So like if I
okay,
got
but you
EBSCO,
wouldn't get all of them.
no,
Like, you don't get the
you'd get a
literature,
big, it's like
You'd get a
cable.
majority of them.
you get a
Yeah,
majority.
you would get a big chunk of the biggest psychology publications, but not all of them. Like you
Yeah.
wouldn't get the
But you don't have
journal.
like physics.
No, no, no.
Because like when I was in school, like we'd have access to,
Oh yeah,
everything.
the
Mhm.
university.
And so that's what I like. I think we all should have access to everything. Like even,
Well,
I mean, in some way,
especially
and I don't know, I don't have a plan for that, but
especially if you pay. Well, I mean that's the thing is like people make it create this thing of like, oh well, there's no such thing as a free lunch or something. But my question is like, what are these companies doing? Like if you look at the biggest academic publishing hosting company in the world is I think Elsevier. I'm not sure how you say that. They're European. But they make more money, they make more profit than Google, not gross, but actual profit, just because their overhead is nothing.
Hmm.
Like these companies are basically Google Drive. Like when you give them
Yep.
the PDF of your research, they host it on a server and then they charge everybody $800 to read it. But what you've done as an academic is you've waived your right to any of the intellectual property in that. You've paid for all the research, they didn't pay for it. You've paid to peer review it, or your colleagues have done that for free, they didn't pay for it. And then you give it to them, which makes your readership of all the people that we want to know about science. We're always talking about like scientific literacy in the public. Well, how are they gonna not get their data from Facebook if they don't have access to this stuff? And you've made your readership zero because the people who can afford it are probably in school where the college is paying these astronomical fees to access it. But what is the company providing? I mean, a Google Drive server where these PDFs float there, what are they doing? Like they're not curating it, they're not creating it, they're not collecting it. They're not really making it terribly searchable if you've ever used an academic library. Like they're not user friendly.
Yeah.
So like why the hell is this the system? And if you had anything in there that you could have copyrighted, nope, now you don't. They own it. So the whole proposition of well, more people see it, or I mean, I don't see the benefit at all. And a lot of times the research again is being paid for by the taxpayer. And
Mhm.
this is just another private company, harvesting all of this stuff and making a lot of the problems associated with research worse.
I think it's so hard on the researcher side as well, because kind of like what you were saying, James, is that you can reach out to a lot of people and get that information because they've spent all this time doing the research. They want people to have access to it. Like researchers can be just as frustrated with the process because here we've done all this work for free and no one's ever going to read it. And we want to try, we're trying to move science forward or, look at different things, but it's not accessible. And then also you're kind of stuck in the spot where you have to publish. If you do not publish, you do not get tenure. And tenure, you get one chance. If you do not get tenure at your university, it's not like you can leave and go to another university. That's it. You get one chance your entire career to make tenure. And so it's like you have to publish all of these articles. And if you don't do that, this is not going to be your career path. And so it's really unfortunate because that's the structure. It's very capitalistic. It's very driven by profit, and it is not accessible to the general population or sometimes even researchers. Kind of what you were saying, Alice, where there are times where even being at a university, you hit a paywall or you still don't have access, and then you have to like go to interlibrary loan and you request it from the librarian, and then the librarian tracks it down. But it's like takes all of this effort just to get access, and then you get the article and you're like, actually this is not really what I need. So I mean, it's just it is so much red tape. It is so many hoops to jump through, and if you can't jump through all those hoops, it's just not possible to do it. It's just so difficult.
And the people who say, well, I don't want to pay for this or something. I mean, to a certain extent, like you're already paying for it. I mean, the
Mhm.
NIH and these giant like endowments for science, the government provides, basically rehosting libraries for a ton of the research that is public. I mean, at a lot of expense. If something comes out later that it's not good, they'll remove it. If you question the methods of some of these things. So like to a certain extent, the redundant infrastructure is already there. It's just that, we like the profit motive. There's a lot of lobbyists there. And a lot of my point when I write articles about things are not that I don't like science or evidence-based practice. It's that I think you have to pick between a profit motive for corporations and science. Which one do you like more? And the people that kind of pretend that you can square both circles, I don't see that. I see those things on a collision course in a lot of places that we just don't want to look at. And like to me, this is sort of bipartisan. I mean, you're dealing with institutions when you talk about research. And so when you're dealing with institutions, you're going to get political friction because, traditionally left wingers are more likely to kind of like fetishize institutions and pretend like, well, this tradition and hierarchy is like great. Where are you picking between the institution and what it does or actual science and evidence-based practice? Because if you're avoiding problems to say, no, I'm going to set a good example and say that I like the trappings and the cosplay of science. Do you like science itself? Whereas, I think traditionally right wingers, when it comes to institutions, they're more likely to kind of have narratives of oppression and distrust institutions and feel like they're exploitive. But really, like, I don't think this system's working for anybody. And more scientific literacy would be a really good thing. I'm wondering if because Alice started talking about EMDR, could we switch maybe to talking about directly the way that the biomedical model and the kind of like objective and empirical driven research is sort of at odds with clinical practice, or at the very least, maybe not helpful to it. I mean, Alice was pointing out that by the time we have the randomized controlled trials that people say, okay, we can see that for these conditions, EMDR works really well. Clinically, we've moved on. Like if you had waited till 1985 till now to adopt EMDR, I'm sorry, there's better stuff out there. EMDR is fine. Like I'm trained in it. I don't really do it anymore because there's more effective things that are now in the process of getting evidence-based. And if you wait 20 years for that system to validate things, I don't feel like I would have helped as many people as I have, or treated as many conditions as I have.
That's also, sorry, I'll say one thing. And it's also part of the structure of being, what am I trying to say? Go ahead, Alice. I'm going to think about it. Go back to me.
I think, sorry, I'm just, you put me on this spot. I think it's very interesting, like, because one of the things we're talking about too is that, like, kind of like, just to pull it together, like the people who are, that we're talking about that don't have time to get tenure and all this stuff, it's like those are also the people who are training the therapists and supposed to be, I mean, there are, institutional like instructors who don't have tenure, but like the best people like are made by the university to be like paying attention to the research. And so then likewise, like in they are not tuned into what is actually happening. Like people doing research are not tuned into what's actually happening on the ground, like feet on the ground in the field, and like what everything is really, how everything, I mean, and you can have, like, I had a really excellent master's program that I think did a really good job of this, but it's still like within all of the confines that I'm talking about, and I think in practice, we can just like how research works. I think I hate the term like ivory towers, but it kind of turns into like we kind of get into our ivory towers of and then not recognizing, like, cross-referencing different modalities and things like that can really be, it's more useful to like bring in that stuff and kind of weave it together. But that's like kind of where we get into like, okay, it kind of turns into like an art, or you have to have like, it's like, this is where our emotional sensitivity and like that quotient and our discernment, like that we learn from all the experience that we have, makes us the best ones at being able to tell, or some of the best at being able to tell like what's really working, what are we seeing, things like that. But we as therapists aren't really given the chance to like report back to the team. It's like they send us off and then nobody and assume that you're doing whatever continuing education, but even that, it's just like, it's just checking a box. Like most people aren't pursuing, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, you're talking about clinical experience and clinical wisdom from seasoned professionals being a part of peer review in journals of psychology, which it largely right now isn't. And a lot of those researchers, when you meet them, they'll tell you, oh, no, I'm a practicing therapist because I work at the student counseling center, 1 day a week or something. I think that's different. I think that's different than really having to go out and take anybody who comes in and treat a wide variety of conditions. And I don't think that's the same thing.
And not to mention, like, along those lines of big CBT and what back then. I mean, again, I know, I worked with a lot of psychiatry residents that all of their classes are CBT focused, and they have one guy dedicated to just nailing that, into them. And it's great. But then you start talking about all these other modalities and things that, in the
80s, like it's great in the 70s. Like, and it's, it still is, but like,
it's great.
But keep going.
Well, it's just like, where did it begin? And then again, and then who trained under CBT over time? And then going back to researchers who made money off. InfoWars is coming out. A lot of people made money off these modalities because it was something that I obviously we all practice CBT if you're a therapist to some degree, but not all the time. But it's ingrained for a reason, because I think it's kind of lazy, and that's just my opinion. Again, and I think
there's a little bit about why that is, maybe, James, and why like research prefers CBT so much, because it's where most people are going to start. Most people are going to start by being like, do you understand that your behavior affects your emotions? Do you understand the role of things you do? Most therapists are not going to leave that out, but I think like you're saying, to make that all psychology is behavior and symptoms and that are measurable with a number, that is incredibly lazy.
Go on.
I was going to say it's lazy in the fact that it also doesn't treat the underlying trauma in the way that trauma is formed. And that's the thing that I think we're seeing a lot of now is a lot of these behaviors spawn from how our brain was rewired in trauma. And I think the lazy aspect of it CBT, and again, we all practice it to some degree, but it's casting a net on some of these behaviors and not necessarily, targeting a specific species. And just like fishing, you cast a net and you're going to grab up a billion fish, but what if you just want tuna? And tuna is trauma, and so you have to find, there's different ways of getting that tuna fish, and there's a lot of there's a specific way of, you can't really just cast a net over it. And I think that's one reason that it worked, is because they saw a lot of this population, it trickled down and it worked for a lot. And people can change their behavior just by thinking about it or changing some patterns, and the behavior changes. But that doesn't solve the thing. The behavior, or they're changing something, again, they're fixing the symptom and not necessarily the actual problem with it.
Well, saying root cause, or saying like emotion you avoid, or saying like insight, all of those, like, certainly when you start talking about somatic energy, all of those are things that cannot be turned into a number for a study. But patient satisfaction and patient self-reported, did I get more out of this than the other one? That can. And we tend to not try and publish those things, because I think a lot of people do want to protect. They want to pretend that all these models of therapy are the same way, in ways that they aren't. Like if you look at a lot of cross comparisons where somebody did, depth analytical work versus CBT in the study, they'll say, hey, how do these 50 models of therapy treat migraine headaches or something? Well, when you look at the study, the person who's doing relational psychoanalysis or something that is a little bit more emotion focused, a lot of times those people are saying, oh my gosh, I realized that this pattern goes on forever. My relationships are better. I'm more creative. And then the researcher's like, yeah, but did the migraine headaches go down? And they're like, yeah, that happened too. And they're like, all right, moderately effective. And that's the raw data is that. Whereas the CBT person is just saying, when I don't eat sugar, when I drink water before bed, when I exercise in the morning, my headaches went down. But the candidate in the study is telling you, I got more out of this model. And the researcher's discarding it to turn that into a number to publish a paper.
Yeah, I think you're really hitting on this idea around quantitative versus qualitative research. And quantitative research is the highest, at the very top of the research tower, driven by biomedical models, and also because they can be published quickly and churned out quickly. And that's also part of the problem of why we see all these modalities taking so long, to catch up to what's going on clinically versus research, because it takes so long to publish research. After you've done, written the article and you've gone through IRB and you do your study, it takes years to get work published sometimes. So by the time it comes out, it's, clinically, people have already figured a lot of that out. And so it's just very hard. And qualitative study take so much more time. And you're right, you cannot quantify people's experiences in that way all the time. Qualitative research is so important, and I'm a huge proponent of it for that reason, because we're able to capture lived experience. We're able to get, instead of saying, did you experience, 1 to 5, what was your scale versus like, what was your actual experience? Use your own words, and being able to use that. I think that often more closely aligns with clinical work, because that's what we're doing. We're talking to people and engaging with people and hearing their stories and their processes and how trauma is directly impacting them. So research is also not motivated to do qualitative work as much. It is completely quantitative driven, and that has been the way it's been since the beginning, and it's still like that now.
Well, and I think that when you go back to why does that exist? I mean, there's two things. Is like, why do we think that way as humans? And then two, like, why did that happen to American politics and British politics around the same time? The why do we do it as humans? Theodore Porter has a really interesting book on the critique of quantification. And he goes through like human history, and he says, like, why did we start to think objectively? Because you go back to the earliest writings, it's all subjective. It's all just, even things that are objective now, like history, are pretty subjective. When somebody's watching, Vesuvius erupt, and they're like, I saw this thing, it was hot, this is what happened. They're not saying, oh, on this date, this thing, like, it's not objective data. So he's
Right.
looking at, why does that happen? And there's a couple of theories, and he tries to go through all the theories we have and then kind of disprove them and say that's actually not it. What it is when you get civilizations that get to a certain size, people don't trust each other. And so objectivity is this way of, in low trust systems, trying to validate things. Like, if I just go next door to James's office and I'm like, hey, I want to buy some milk from your cow, and James is like, okay, here you go. I just kind of trust, because I have this relationship, that milk is going to be, good milk. But when you get larger systems, the Bronze Age carving about the copper merchant is the one that, like, all the anthropology students are going to learn, is this guy complaining about, don't buy from Ahmed, his copper, it sucks, it's not good, it's mixed with lead. It's when we need these outside organizations to come in and say a third party has verified that this is what you're getting. It's usually around markets, and it's usually around lack of trust. And what it does is it says that nothing can be self-evident. And I think that, on that first point of our human need for objectivity, we should really be able to have more trust that some of these things, like somatic psychology, even if we can't turn it into a perfect variable, that there's a somatic relationship to emotion. Let's stop researching that, because I think that most people who practice things, clinically have seen that there are kind of somatic carriers of emotion. There's markers, and a lot of neurology is looking at that. The second thing is, like, the reason that CBT takes over in the 80s is because when Reagan and Thatcher come in, that's part of their promise, is that they're going to only fund things that are effective, that tax money is not going to be wasted. So schools are going to have to prove that the kids get smarter with all this standardized testing. Hospitals are going to be subjected to these metrics. Well, that doesn't ever really work. When you look at the hospitals that were effective and got all that federal funding in the 80s, a lot of them were just reclassifying chairs as hospital beds to say, yeah, all the patients were in the beds. Like, literally, that's a thing that happened. You see those metrics getting moved around, but it doesn't actually make progress better. But you do see CBT become the preferred modality, because it's something that lets you reduce everything down to a number so it can pass randomized controlled trials, which good models of psychotherapy have a subjective element that you can't turn into a number, so we don't prefer it. And that's like why that takes over, I think, in a way that is not great. And when you look at why CBT has like worse and worse returns every year, that clinically it's showing that this is supposed to be the best model, but then you look at patient outcomes in the real world and they actually are getting worse the more that's adopted. And that's for a couple reasons. I mean, one is that you can do things in a lab you can't do in a clinic, but I think more broadly, a lot of those people that were trained in CBT and said they were doing CBT, like one of my favorite providers locally, Win Sheps, is, you know, he says he's a CBT guy, but when you look at him and his therapy and run cases with him, he's a lot more relational and kind of psychodynamic. But those guys were learning that stuff in the water, even though they said they were CBT practitioners. And as that stuff quit being taught in colleges, they didn't have any skills other than CBT. So you really are seeing the effect of it in a vacuum when you have
Right.
people in the 90s and the 2000s that are graduating from school and they don't know anything about the history of the profession. And the way that even somebody in the 80s who says I do CBT, they really did. They got a lot of that embodied wisdom from the 60s and 70s just in the water of their training. So I think those are two variables that are important to kind of sit with when you're looking at how the industry moved there.
Yeah. And I think too, you can kind of zoom out to the macro level of like the collective and everything. And it's like, that's sort of just evident, or shows us like where I think it's like the common denominator, or like reduction to the mean of like what the collective consciousness is able to even like process and understand. And it's like this, like, cognition plus behavior is still this like touch point that like science is grappling with. It's like the other ivory towers haven't caught up. And so even while psychology is like 60 years down the road, or 50 years down the road from CBT, it's like we are far and beyond it. And so, but then like we're saying, there's this echo, it's kind of in this vacuum. And so at the outset, when CBT was first being practiced, people were innovators who were doing something new. And it was on the cusp of what the collective was like putting together and thinking about. But when we churn out people 30 years later doing the same thing, it's just totally stripped of what was innovative about it in the first place. And we're telling counselors, no, you need to do this exact thing in this like very, neutered, stripped down way from back then. And we're just taking the practitioners are the artists, are the ones who like are the interpreters of the research, just like lawyers are interpreters of the law, like we are the interpreters and the practitioners of it. But we're being held back by like the collective not being able, it's just like quite hasn't caught like it just like science, like it's like the neurologists and the physicists can't really get their hands around how cognition and behavior would be connected because they can't understand consciousness. And so it like creates this like anchor where it's like, no, the public isn't going to let us move on from like, what is this with cognition and behavior until all the other like quote unquote ivory towers like have caught up and start to understand like what we're talking about over here.
That's a fantastic point, Alice, because you're talking about recentering psychology as a response to the environment of the world, which changes, and it's not 1988.
Yep.
And so to say that there's a best model of psychotherapy, we found it passed a randomized controlled trial, so let's do this one forever. One, you're going to get people that are deeply incurious, that like hierarchies, that like tradition more so than they like innovation or maybe helping people that navigate towards a system like that. But two, it just isn't honest. It's like saying we should do Victorian, education in schools. Like,
yeah.
Big CBT took Joel out.
Big CBT. Yeah. No, it does feel like that. And this gets to, I harp about there's like a big pyramid scheme and within the world of therapy too, about like what you're even, you can say you practice CBT coming out of school, but there are all these other modalities like EMDR. You have to pay a few more $1,000s to get the training to do EMDR after you've gone to school, even though in school you learn like this is like a standard thing, and like we're saying that's 20 years ago, but you have to come out of school and then pay, $500 or $1,000 to do the basic training. But then you really need the second level training too. And then and then after you've done that, then you can say that you practice it when you're advertising. Then you can say you practice it when you have it on your description, but only after you've done these things and jumped through all these hoops. And then there's like the next, and you're supposed to have multiple of these. And then they make you tell you that, but the way to really make money with this modality is if you are a supervisor of people who are trying to train for it. And so then you do that extra training, and then you're just charging other therapists to like spend an hour with you talking about that modality. And that's where you're really supposed to make the money. I felt like that, and I don't know if y'all have this in your experience, but a lot of the like trainings and things that I'm really passionate about you sort of get behind the curtain, and then that's like that's always the takeaway, like kind of at the end. It's like, I mean, and it makes sense to turn us into trainers, but it also just starts having this ring of like, wait a minute, but we're charged, so we're supposed to, like, our paycheck is supposed to come from like other therapists who barely make any money, and we know how this goes. Like, that's I don't know.
Some
It's
of those are more
parasitic
expensive
or
than your master's degree.
cannibalistic. Yeah.
Like looking at you, Peter Levin and Richard Swartz. I mean, that's
Yeah.
you're going to have $15,000 in SE by the time you're done.
Right.
And which, I mean, this kind of, I know James has some like thoughts on this, but I mean, like this gets me to like one of the other points is like, we're bad at being able to figure out like why something works and that it works separately in research. Like if research doesn't have a neurological description of something, it's very hesitant to say, hey, this works. People are liking it. I was talking to Matt Hongoltz-Hetling on one of the last podcasts about Anton Franz Mesmer, the guy who invented hypnosis. And he thought it worked because of, yeah, like he thought it worked because of animal magnetism and these things that are not objective, that can't be seen. You know, it turns out magnets don't really do that much to animals. But all of those techniques of like energy and noticing somebody and matching their energy and regulating them somatically and mirroring, those were the real reason why mesmerism was effective and later became medical hypnosis, which is a very valid thing. But the reason that he thought that it worked, that neurobiological reason, was not actually right. Same with EMDR. I mean, Shapiro made a perfectly good guess about why EMDR worked. Turns out that's not right, 40 years of neurology later. But the technique is effective in some ways that were taken by people like Dr. Vasquez and Dr. Grand and innovated on to create these other things. And a lot of times, if we just figure out that something works, I think research is very hesitant to say, hey, this is effective. Let's go find out why, because they want to understand the root cause. And that just isn't how we discover things, I don't think. I think innovation is a more squishy energy than that.
Which is crazy. Like going to anesthesiology, like they don't know why that works, like anesthesia. They don't know, so there's no root cause of why when you get put under with any type of anesthetic, they don't know why you just go, it's not a real sleep. It's not, you're numb. You're not awake. They have
Western medicine doesn't know. Like if you get into go talk to Eastern medicine and they can explain to you why consciousness works that way. But we don't acknowledge it here because the ivory towers haven't caught up with that. When nobody connects the dots, people don't understand like what that is.
But going with other modalities is it doesn't translate well when you get into psychology and things like that. And again, going back to a bias of a reviewer in articles and what you want to publish, that blind reviewer, the one that we can't, we don't know who they are, they might be a modality elitist of some different modality or some different thing, and have a different opinion and kind of, they're not supposed to, but there's always an innate bias in the human aspect. So they're going to look at this, whatever this new research in there, and be like, that sounds kind of weird. Like, can they replicate this? Or just like, this goes against CBT, this is not this is not at all. And that reviewer is going to mark up your research and going to say, yeah, that's not it. And then a lot of publications, a lot of journals are going to say it has to meet these requirements, that it matches our reviewers perfectly. And, but again, it's blind for you. So you don't know if you're going to get somebody that's going to be beneficial for you or detrimental. One of my guys, Dr. Burke, he says that he knows a lot of these journals and what they look for. And so he literally formats his writing to those things, which I'm like, that's great. You get published pretty easily, but what are you sacrificing for that? And it's a little deeper discussion with him, but
yeah. I mean, the quality is just totally different in having to, and if you want to, which I think a big purpose of research is to bring forth new information and find new things and discover new things that we don't know, but we're so comfortable with, well, if it doesn't fit the standard, if we can't randomize control trial it, or if it's not already published 1 million times prior, that's already supported, then we don't want to do it. There's a lot more fear in that to be able to go in that direction.
Well, I mean, so one of the things that I'd like to get y'all's opinion on, and some of you guys have a lot more experience directly with it than I do, but when you say I have a problem with evidence-based practice, or what's the point in academic libraries or whatever, I mean, the first thing that I get usually from psychology clinical psychology students that have just taken their first research 101 class and Googled me and decided that I'm a crank because I use brain spotting. That's the most frequent email that I get. They'll say, oh, well, it's because it's peer reviewed. It's peer reviewed. So the concept of peer review, that you would have people who know how to read science sit down and look at your article and not know who you are and not know their relationship to you or not know you at all, so that they can do that in a way without bias. I like that as an idea. As a practice, I don't think that the way that we do peer review right now does much. And we have data on that. I mean, was it Alan Sokol in 1996? And then I think in like the 2010s, Bohannon, these guys would just publish garbage to kind of, it ends your career to do that. Like, you have to kind of be academically antagonistic, which means that academia is not going to like you. But they would basically just put in, like, Sokol put in a whole bunch of biases that he knew that people had about certain cultural ideas, and then just published something that was just complete nonsense. Like, he said that if you were transgressive and pushed boundaries, then it affected quantum gravity on this molecular level that they had seen, like, within cells or something. And it got published over and over again. These organizations pick it up. So when people defend these things as like, well, this is what they do, we kind of have data, evidence through science of people seeing if that process does anything. And time again, it doesn't really do much, because the person who is just a burned out researcher who's having to do this for their job and not getting paid, and then also like not even really aware of the thing that you're doing, or sort of like in the same waters that you're in, even if you're in the same field, being like, yeah, okay, this is scientific. Is that really a peer review of a group of your actual, ideological peers challenging and improving your thought process and your kind of scope of practice there? I don't know. I mean, what's y'all's experience with that?
I will say my experience, because I've gone through peer review and have peer review publications, you typically do not have more than 2 individuals that peer review that article, and then the editor will look over it, but the editor, unless they just see a glaring red flag, is going to go with whatever the peer review person said. And you think, oh, peer review people, they're like trained. No, it's just other academics in your field. And so depending on the topic, a lot of times if you're in a small, very specific research community, you can tell who's peer reviewing your work, because there's only those people who can peer review it, because they are the only other ones that write about it and study it. So sometimes it really isn't blind. And I think, the idea is good, but the reality is you're just getting 2 individual people's perspectives on your article, and they're calling that peer review.
Well, I think like a more equitable model too might be to make these things public for a period of time. Like, if you're going to build a road in your town, you have to post it publicly and see who has objections, who has feedback. And yeah, you get some cranks, in that process, but you also maybe get some good ideas. And I think that if these things were a little bit more public, a little bit more transparent, then, we grabbed 2 burned out, adjuncts from our university, you may get a better thing, because the incentive structure, I think what it rewards, especially in psychology, is that if you've got a ton of money, you can just spend enough to ram one of these things through into publication. And I thought about, when we were planning for this episode, like getting some of the research that's from like really big name people who I personally dislike. And I decided not to be that petty and like read their research on here. But there's a ton of people who like really went after analytical psychology in the 90s and talked about how CBT was wonderful and like it fixed everything, and like we didn't need relational psychoanalysis, we didn't need anything that had any kind of like spiritual or deeper emotional element, like emotional transformation therapy or Jungian therapy. Basically, that the unconscious wasn't real. This was this thing that was just made up for analysts to suck up all the patient's money and take all this time, which, sometimes psychoanalysis is a waste of time, but just because you prove that doesn't mean that you prove the unconscious isn't real. And they published all this stuff. Now it's trendy to be like, oh, trauma in the deep brain or whatever. So the same people, they didn't retract anything. They're now, after publishing about the subconscious not being real, they now have these papers where they're like, well, there are primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of cognition, and then the bottom levels contain more of a symbolic, less literal component, and also somatic reactions that budget emotional, releases of energy. And you're like, oh, you mean a fucking unconscious? Is that what you're trying to say? None of these people had to say they're wrong. They didn't have to take anything back. I mean, they're able to publish those things. there's a guy that particularly dislikes brain spotting, and so he'll publish stuff every once in a while. But there's and big name journals, but there's nothing of merit in the article. Like there's one of them where he says, I heard about this brain spotting thing. I've not trained in it. I've never done it, but one of the theories of it is that it's somehow engaging the subcortical brain. And I remember when I went to medical school in 1980, this is like in an academic publication, all of the memory in the brain is not in the subcortical brain. So there's no memory there. Like where memory is in the brain is one of the most complicated questions in all of cognitive science. And you've got somebody who's publishing something saying that they remember their textbook from when they became a doctor in a different field that's somehow publishing in academic psych publications. So if you want to say peer review and specialization and whatever, why are these guys allowed to publish? It's because they're rich. It's because they can ram these things through by spending money.
There are a lot of predatory publishing groups. I mean, that's just part of the capitalistic model of this, where, there's a lot of expectation to pay thousands of dollars to get your article published. Or if you have tried to publish multiple other places where you say you don't have to pay, they won't accept it. But you can always find one that will take it if you pay enough money. And so how is that peer reviewed if you're just buying your article to be published? I mean, I think that's a big part of the problem too.
I think that one thing that may be helpful is because one of the questions that you're going to get, because, I do respond to a lot of the emails that I get from people that, I think are genuine, even if some of it's kind of misguided. And I remember that, like, I learned a lot of kind of like Jungian and somatic psychology when I was in undergrad, when I was doing comparative religion. And then when I went to go get my degree, I was like, okay, that's all for D&D and world building and creative stuff. Now I'm going to be a serious therapist and do science. And I learned that CBT was the best thing. And I read all these books on it and kept being like, but this seems kind of obvious, like you snap a rubber band and tell the anxiety to stop. Like this doesn't seem like it goes. When I was trying it with patients, when I was first working, and patients weren't resonating with it. And so I just followed what I found to be effective, which I ended up, learning to trust myself, going somewhere that was totally different than where I was kind of told to go or where the incentives pointed at me. So I don't think that people send those emails because they're stupid or because like they want to be aggressive or something. Like I think that they're in school, they're in the same place that I was, and I relate to it. So I'm not judging it. But like the big question that they always have is like, okay, so how would you do it? All right, I guess we should just get rid of licensors, just get rid of boards, and we treat everything with crystals and rainbows. And, of course, that's not what I'm saying. So if we go back to the impact factor system, the H-index system, the academic publishing industry, what are like really easy and probably, I don't want to say bipartisan because it's not political, but just universally accepted solutions that anybody who's willing to kind of sit creatively with this stuff would be like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. What could we do to change it, fix it, tomorrow?
That's a big question, but I think that at least the first thing for me is like, it cannot be capitalistically incentivized, like the pay structure, the way that it's set up, the structure of the academy in general. I think these are systemic, larger issues of how the academy is set up, and it's very elitist, and it's meant, it's become that, and a lot of academics want to keep it that way. And so I think that's a big part of figuring out how to support people in the academy and also be able to get that research to the general population, or also to therapists or anyone who works in any kind of specialized field that there's research being done.
Well, and a lot of these complaints are not things that like I make up in my head because I don't have like a ton of overlap with research. They come from conversations with doctors, with researchers who are also complaining about these things because they want to discover stuff. I mean, that's where a lot of my perspective comes from, is talking to people who are making things that are interesting that I call up and see if they'll talk to me. I probably read more research than most therapists because I'm really interested in this stuff. And that's why it makes me angry when I feel like it isn't as effective as it could be. So, I mean, I think just listening to the people in the field, and I mean, Hailey, when you're saying that like a lot of the people like in that academy are not open to it. I mean, well, you're driving out everybody who's not just going to have this intuition and kind of creative impulse and like being in it, for the lack of a better word, the right reasons. you drive all those people out, what are you left with? I mean, you have a PhD and you're not doing research because you felt like you were going to help more people in therapy. I don't want to speak for you there, but you had some problems with it. Can you tell us about those things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one, I'm a qualitative researcher in the social work field, and even within social work, I really had the rose-colored glasses on going into it because I didn't go back to get a PhD. I went back because I wanted to be a good practitioner. I wanted to be able to use research and clinical work together to be able to, address some of these systemic issues that we're seeing. But when you get in there, you are a cog in a machine is really what it felt like for me. And I was like, well, yes, science is important, but it's science and art. It's art and science together. I think, that is such a big piece of it. And that's like where that creative side and that exploring and research side of what is going on, the social phenomenon that we see going on socially, culturally within our communities, or we're hearing feedback from therapists like this is happening, but nobody's studying it. And then you're like, okay, well, we'll just study it. And then you get in the academy and it's like, ooh, we don't want to talk about that. That's too politicized. There is a structure that the expectation of how you will perform is very strong. A lot of times it's unspoken, but it's made pretty evident pretty early on that if you want to do qual, just know it's going to be twice as hard for you. You are more likely to get a tenure track job if you are quantitative, which again is distilling everything down to numbers, and people aren't numbers. Everyone's experience is different. And I think
we're not computers. And
exactly.
so much of the biomedical model has been this attempt to prove that if you just get all the data, all the variables, you can really just sort of crack the code of this and have the perfect model of therapy that is completely turned into a formula, completely without provider insight, completely without patient subjective experience, and completely without qualitative variable or quantitative variables that can't just be reduced down to a number. And I don't think you're ever going to solve that problem. One of the things that bothers me, James, you were talking about how psychiatrists are trained. If I'm a nurse, my boss is a nurse, right? Like I'm the boards or the people that do billing, they're medical. If I'm an engineer, my boss is an engineer. If I'm a therapist, why is somebody who's probably never been in therapy, who's not really ever been trained in therapy, the one who's deciding whether or not insurance claims go through, if what I'm doing is real, like what I should be trained in to be on an insurance panel? It's not a therapist who's making that call. It's a biomedical doctor who may know a whole lot about Wellbutrin and antibiotics, but it's very rare in my experience to find any of those people that's ever been in therapy as a patient, which is part of understanding how it works, and ever been in therapy training beyond 6 sessions of CBT tells the person to change their behavior, and then if that doesn't reduce the symptom, then you go ahead and do drugs. That's what I see. I don't know if that's something y'all encounter.
Well, I was going to say that I think that it's gone to the cookbook model, where everything is just, a formula or recipes to kind of get you this product. And there's a doctor that I worked with that was just like, I hate the cookbook model. Nobody could fit in this specific thing over and over again. Which is even in school, like you get hammered out to learn CBT because that's the thing that's going to make it in the field. And it's easy to teach. It's easily to replicate in the person. You could be a great therapist, but a terrible CBT practitioner. And I think that, and vice versa, you could be a great CBT practitioner, but not a great therapist. And I think we've lost our inquisitive minds to kind of fit things that work. I remember my eye-opening in grad school was learning crisis intervention. What is not CBT at all? Like you're in a moment of crisis. You're not changing a behavior. You're trying to change an outcome of what's going to happen in that crisis. And so you're not even. But that was a huge thing going through school. Was like, what does crisis intervention look like? But when I learned what mindfulness-based stress reduction can do and saw the research on that, I mean, that was after school where I was like, oh, this is awesome. Why didn't I know this when I was going through grad school and have free training basically in it? And they don't, it's free training in CBT.
Just
Why,
to take up for, can I just really quick take up? I think
No,
it's
please.
also different, like depending on what kind of grad program you're doing.
Mhm, yeah.
Because y'all are all social workers, but like within the field of counseling, like the structure of what we're learning is so different. Like CBT was big in undergrad. In my which I went to University of Colorado at Boulder. It's the Boulder model. It's all about, there's a major research emphasis there. So CBT was like baked into just my psychology grade and undergrad level. But once I got to grad school, it was really like, this is like very beginning of what we talked about. And then it was all other types of modalities like that, or like mindfulness and somatic stuff and trauma-based perspectives. So it really, it does really depend on like what program you're going to and what your, what the perspectives are. And that is dictated by like who the, it gets back to like who the professors are, what the research is, and what's getting funded. But I know, like they're just different little subtle differences in like how counselors and MFTs are trained versus social workers versus psychologists versus psychiatrists. And we kind of don't acknowledge that like some of us might have, like I went to a KCREP, counseling, psychology, and counselor education, where you actually learn to educate other counselors. And so there's this whole meta level, but there's totally tons of different types of education and like types of therapists that are out there. But what we are talking about is like kind of the anchor of the field. What's really like still like holding us. It's like this touch point of, which is kind of creating this, it's just, it zaps the creativity from the field, and it zaps the independence of the practitioners, and it's boring. It's boring because it's not at this point innovative. It does seem like it's like, CBT and stuff like that. It feels like it's just intuitive knowledge by this point. But
Well, and if we could talk a little bit about what the biomedical model is, because I don't really think that the biomedical model is a bad thing. I think it's always going to be a part of care. If somebody comes in and they don't know that if they don't get sleep, or if they don't know how to get sleep, that their, depression or anxiety is not going to come down. If somebody comes in and they're using too much alcohol or they're using illegal drugs, and you just say, all right, we don't have to worry about all this pesky intellectual knowledge and skills. I'm just going to cure this with yoga and meditation. Well, maybe drinking a fifth a day is the more important thing first. That biomedical model is something that you're always going to be in conversation with, and we should be. I don't think that it's something that can contain all of consciousness, that can contain all of therapeutic work, because at its heart, what it's doing is saying, here's a list of check boxes. And when we check these boxes, then you now have this disorder. And this disorder, we're going to study which treatments it responds to. And so when all these other people in the study checked those boxes and we gave them this disorder, let's see, which models made that go up or down. And now we know that if you have generalized anxiety disorder, if you have bipolar 1, that, this is a kind of therapy that works. This is a kind of therapy that doesn't. Broad strokes, I think that's fine. But even when you take them at their word, it's like they don't want to use that model. They don't want to go ahead and go all the way with it. Like, we know that something like ADHD, like we've known for a really long time. I think Dr. Amen said this in the 70s or maybe the 80s. Like, you can look at a QEEG brain map and you can see that there are 6 different things that can happen in the brain that result in the same boxes being checked for ADHD and respond to the same medication, but they're not the same thing. So you're treating them like they're the same disorder. And if you go back and you point something like that out, they're just going to be like, oh, well, it's not realistic or effective or cost effective to go ahead and do a QEEG brain map for everybody to see which disorder they actually have. So, that seems like it's the biomedical model being like, oh, well, the model itself is kind of too inconvenient, so we're just going to do it this way. Even if you want to do it the way that they're saying that they want to do it, then there's places that you could do that better that they still don't want to go. Does that sort of make sense? Or James, do you have any kind of, have you seen those catch-22s in the hospital?
Oh, all the time. Obviously, in consult psychiatry, you're going to run into, on the medicine side, there's a lot of things that go on that are just not the things that you're not able to replicate out anywhere else outside of the hospital, obviously. But those things exist, and I'm kind of drawing a blank. I just got an email about something, but Yes, we did have those a lot. I mean, you're going to see that the things outside of our control play a big role, like as a therapist, with the people that we work with. And it's whether or not, if the person that we're working with is doing the things that we want them to or not. It is hard.
Yeah.
To kind of sit in that space.
Well, and like, let's just set a little bit, because I think the big one thing we're not acknowledging, and maybe the most important thing, is that our clients are the experts on themselves.
Yeah.
And like every individual you work with is an expert on themselves. They don't have to know about all what is in the research to know what their experience of themselves is. And so as long as we're, putting somebody else, like we have this whole page, hierarchical thing happening over here, and we and we're sitting here like feeling like humble therapists, like why won't anybody pay attention to us? But really, like, the people who are suffering are our clients, and they're just screaming out, like, even more so, and beating their heads against the wall. I mean, well, sometimes literally, trying to like find a therapist who's not just gonna like just do motivational interviewing and like CBT, like who will actually relate to them as like a real human and meet them where they are.
Yep.
And like be responsive in their treatment instead of just prescriptive.
Hailey, have you seen anything like that, where the biomedical model is sort of in tension with these newer ideas they're trying to tack on, like, oh, everything should be person-centered, or we should maintain a concept of person in the environment, or we should, have more of that, like, because I see, people coming back and being like, oh yeah, we trained y'all all in CBT, but now the industry's saying trauma, so we're going to do CBT TF or something. We're going to tack a spoiler on the Civic to make it a different car. Do you see things like that? Because you have probably more experience, in the PhD world than any of us.
Yeah, I mean, and surprisingly enough, being a PhD, even in social work, is not really social work or therapy or therapeutic. I mean, you do learn if you study certain things, but the PhD model is very much driven by the medical model. And so whatever medicine does, it's kind of the standard for other research programs. Whatever medicine does, that's what everybody else wants to do, because that's how they've seen it's been successful. That's how they see it's profitable. And I think there is like this tension, right, between we want an answer to fix things and we want to know that it works before we do it, but that's just not how humans work. That's just like what you were saying, Alice, like it just really takes all the creativity, all your ability to use your own intuition and to listen and to engage with the client. And it's really putting all the oneness on the therapist to be the expert in the room. And not to mention that's a lot of pressure on a therapist, but that's also not how it should be. It's so top down. The model is so driven that way, that even if you are trying to do a grassroots effort to come from the bottom and like engage in work that's maybe not as CBT or even anything different, it's just you will bump into so many roadblocks. I think people's ability to complete and do a PhD has a lot more to do with their ability to keep jumping through the hoops than necessarily just being smart. Like if you can figure out the system and learn how to jump through the hoops, you can be successful, but at what cost? And each researcher has to really ask themselves, is this what you can't be a researcher and not be in it's almost impossible to be a researcher and not be set within this model. It's very hard to break out of it.
Well, and I think that if we could maybe give some clinical examples of where, if you took these models at face value and you looked at everything that objective research wants to research about psychology, where you would be kind of missing the real point of, I think, a lot of what we do. Because to me, when you take anxiety and you turn it into a diagnosis, when you take depression and you turn it into a diagnosis, you're cutting these things off from the real root of where they come from, which a lot of times we want to think about this stuff like genes. And you don't get anxiety like you get cancer. You don't get anxiety like you get the flu, and then you take this retroviral, or you take this antibiotic. Like, you get anxiety because there's a lack of balance in your life. Maybe you're outgrowing like an older identity, and you need to let go of parts of that identity to hear a greater whole of you that you need to remember. You get depressed maybe when you're making yourself fit a box that you never even knew was a box, but you've mistook the box for who you were or all that you could be. You get anxiety and depression and all of these things as part of dynamic forces, that it takes a certain amount of subjectivity and a certain amount of things that can never be a formula to really sit with and help someone hear, who am I? What do I want to be? And so many times those goals that somebody comes in with of, I don't want to bite my fingernails, I don't want to drink alcohol anymore, I can't sleep. When you really listen to that, what happens is that you go a whole lot deeper into a person and into a problem. And the people who are going to the oncologist, they know what the problem is, in the way that the people going to therapy know the beginning of this pathway, but it's not the end, and it's not the whole thing, in a way that I think we've are in the process of kind of losing as a profession, in a way that's scary to me. Can you all have kind of examples in your work where I don't know. I mean, we all are kind of in the same world, but we work differently. Are there places where, you get somewhere with subjectivity you never would have gotten with, kind of a empirical objective method alone?
Yeah. I mean, I still think everything to me, and the field is moving in this direction a little bit, but how trauma does inform pretty much everything that I see.
Mhm.
And I think, I think therapists on the ground, more so than like psychiatrists, or I mean, psychiatrists are still out there diagnosing everyone with borderline. And I think that that's like sort of I have opinions there, but it's sort of a
Mhm.
made up thing. And it's really complex trauma, what we're seeing. And so, and then among that population, the trauma, like the interface between trauma symptoms and ADHD symptoms, trauma symptoms and autism, and then the compounded, like, because you grow up with autism, that is traumatic to have like the world like set up not for you, and like not reflecting back what your experience is. But so everything, and so trying to differentiate, whereas like psychiatry wants to throw everybody in the same boat of like, okay, this person is just emotionally erratic, it's like just a modern way of saying like hysteria. But there's so many subtle aspects, and we get into autism, and there's like, I mean, we could do episodes and episodes, but about differences in consciousness, and how that works, and like what we should be pathologizing, and what really is like a higher method, or a higher way of being in a lot of cases. But trying to differentiate that, when it's like, I'll get these patients and it's like they've been just like labeled borderline since they were 13, and it's like, okay, what are we actually seeing here? Like, did you cut one time and somebody gave you a borderline diagnosis? That's automatically what I hear.
And again, not to beat up on the researchers and the doctors, because if you are a woman and you try to, like, have a suicide attempt, or you present in distress and you get sent to the ER, you're probably going to get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder on that discharge. And I think that's wrong, because they don't have time to assess that. They don't know if your reaction was a normal or understandable reaction to the environment that you're coming out of. And a lot of times they miss problems in the home and the environment, which, they're in the ER, they don't have time to play detective. But that doctor is required, in order to get paid and to use your insurance, so that you don't have this bill, to give you a diagnosis. And that's the best one they can come up with in the 30 minutes while you're there. If they weren't required to do that, if that was a system that was rethought, I mean, a lot of those providers probably don't want to have to do that anyway. I mean, we do the things in our job that we have to. And when you make that one of them, you're going to continue to get that result, even if the provider is good and well intentioned and understand these concepts. And a lot of times when you talk to them, they do. James, you do a lot of the kind of mindfulness stuff, and then brain spotting with more kind of executives and doctors. Can you explain some of the ways that you get to a place that is, I don't know, more of an energy or a subjective realm, that doesn't quite fit into a number, but is the root of a lot of the effectiveness of some of those things?
Well, first off, it's funny that, and I don't know how this is going to be taken, but I get a lot of that type of population coming in that kind of had said, talk therapy just doesn't work for me. I have not had success with talk therapy. And it's like, well, what is talk therapy to you? Because that could be a lot of things. That's just a sounding board, and they're like, well, it's kind of CBT. They try to make me rethink this and that. I get to a place where a lot of these, especially a lot of these high functioning, well, I guess high functioning is a weird term. People have this idea that I need something more, something actionable, something not necessarily physical, to kind of get me into this space that is very beneficial for myself. And you get to a point that they offer. I mean, you just go with the flow. It is the person that is in front of you again that you are paying attention to, and not necessarily the cookbook of options to kind of I allow my individuals to kind of, again, not be the professional in what I provide, but be professional of themselves. And then they'll offer up some stuff. And I'm like, that's it. That's what we're going to go. We're going to do brain spotting. This would be perfect for you, and things like that. I've dived into a lot of shadow work recently because a lot of people are having, which is a very, it's very woo-woo in the sense of like, no one wants to talk about what the shadow is. And that's happened naturally to a lot of the people that I've seen come through.
It's a collective. It's a thing happening in the collective. And it's people, and that's where we're kind of coming back around to the field has kind of moved into like trauma. And this is where the collective and the peanut gallery are kind of catching up, and the language that we're using that's more accessible to everybody is shadow work. I mean, it's a perfect, and it does bring back in like the original, like, Jungian terminology. So it makes, it's basically like our patients are now showing up saying, we want to do that. We're here to do the work, is what that means to me,
Yeah. That's what I was trying to talk about when I was like, not physical. They want to do something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think what you're talking about, James, is the ability of the intellect to avoid emotion. That a lot of times, I mean, because I've had very skilled talk therapists that were really able to stop me from being able to deflect and entertain and like push me into the thing that I'm avoiding feeling. But to my experience with therapy, I mean, that's what works. And brain spotting does that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
In a way that we may not even really fully understand how it works, but it's reproducible, and we know that it does. But one of the reasons why on this podcast, like I like to sit with the kind of crazy new age woo-woo concepts, and also, a lot of these kind of like Eastern wisdom traditions and perennial philosophy, and then also state-of-the-art neuroscience, is that when you do that, I think there is kind of a synthesis in how a lot of these things are saying the same thing, like something like shadow work, like you're talking about, which is, Jungian. There's a lot of mysticism and things that people may want to discount because it scares them or they're not familiar with those concepts if you crack those books. But look at what it's saying. It's saying that there are huge emotional reactions that you avoid feeling, those implicit emotions. I don't want to feel trapped. I don't want to feel out of control, or that you're enmeshed with, that you feel all the time. I have to be this angry. I have to be this aware. I have to understand how everything works or else I'm not safe. And that, going into the shadow in a Jungian sense is challenging your relationship to those things. What if you can go back and feel that without dying? What if you can let go of this and you can still be okay and you can still feel safety without anger? I mean, that's shadow work and polyvagal theory, and a whole lot of, the interesting work that people like Gazzaniga and Damasio and many, many more are doing, are noticing those same things in neurology and cognitive sciences in a way that those professions seem to be comfortable with. And for some reason, academic psychology is less comfortable with them than neurology and cognitive science. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Hailey, you work with women and mothers a lot. Do you see places where their experience or the factors that are influencing them just don't fit perfectly into a diagnosis, or sort of clash with the randomized controlled trial model for figuring out how to help?
I mean, yeah, the short answer, yeah. I think my experience with that, really, a lot of that is, again, research or a lot of models or interventions are top down. And that's what's being used. Again, birth has now become hyper medicalized. And so again, we're thrown back kind of into that medical model. But yeah, I think there is a huge disparity around women not being able to have a voice or share their experiences, or know what, they just have these expectations of, oh, well, this is just what I'm supposed to do because this is what everybody else has done or what my mom told me would happen, versus like what the actual experience was. So I think there's just such a disconnect, particularly around birthing, but even more just because you're forced to want to fit into this medical model that it doesn't work, because it's a very intense, it is a traumatic experience. It's a life-changing experience. And again, check boxes you can't quantify that. And I think women have a hard time. There's that expectation to be like, how was your birth? How did it go? Did it do? And women can't even verbalize that. It's like, because it's not that way for them. And so even just holding space for women to be able to have those opportunities is really important. I found, that is such a critical piece, like doing all of this, doing research is what I studied. My PhD is we have a lot of quantitative data. We don't really know what women are experiencing. And for me, that's a really important place to start. Instead of assuming that we know or doctors know what's best for women.
And are you saying there, Hailey, that, a lot of times we're not maybe aware of our emotional experience or the way that our environment's affecting us? So even if we do the screener in the hospital and we check for traumatic birth or we check for something, that we still, maybe are missing something because we haven't made room to consider kind of a deeper embodied or, I don't want to speak for you, but
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll just share my own personal experience of like when, you get 1 6-week postpartum checkup and they give you, the depression form. They don't really talk about it. It's just like in your paperwork. And, even as someone who I felt like I advocated for myself, I was so embarrassed that I was experiencing like postpartum depression that I just kind of, I don't know. I try to mark things a little bit higher because I didn't want to bring it up with my doctor. But then she was just like flipping through and was like, oh, looks like you're good. No depression, and I was just like on the verge of having a complete breakdown. Like there is just no space for that. There is very little room to be able to hold space and there to feel safe. Safety is a huge thing. And I think there's very little space within those, you see your doctor once 6 weeks postpartum, that's it. To be able to, address a lot of things that are still going on physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, they're getting missed.
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our episode. Is there anybody that has, anything else that feels like a good place to share something before we end that we don't get to?
I don't have anything, but we could spend forever talking about birth. I'm just like holding my tongue over here. We could talk about
Yeah, I'm sure we will again.
Attachment and birth and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think,
Trauma.
for me, one of the things that I'd like to see is us separate, how something works from does it work, and just see, is it reproducible first, and then figure out all of the different smushier variables about those things. And then, as a pathway to that, maybe make room for things that are just self-evidencing, that we just say, we know these things are true, even though maybe they're not directly provable, in a way that would let somatic psychology and other things be more a part of medicine than they are. Well, I appreciate you guys getting on today, and we'll see you next week.
Alrighty.
Let's put all these words away. Let's put all these words away. Let's put all these words.
Hey guys, I wanted to pop in here to give you a quick reminder that we do this podcast for free, and there are significant expenses associated with it, including the biggest resource in my life right now, which is time. One of the things that would really help us, and hopefully would help you, would be to check out one of our sponsors, Hardy Nutritionals. Hardy is a vitamin company that I never encountered the advertising of. We heard over and over again from multiple people with treatment-resistant anxiety and dopamine disorders like bipolar disorder and other things that they had tried everything and Hardy was what worked. And so I checked them out, and they have really good research. I'm not a fan of a lot of the BS that's in the supplement and wellness space. Hardy paid for a lot of research on their product, and when I ordered some for myself, I saw a big difference in my life. And my wife made fun of me, thought I was going to be Alex Jones selling vitamins on the radio, and when she tried them, she really liked them too. There's a lot of data about how they can reduce the symptoms of ADHD without medications or lower your need for medication, also manage some of the effects of autism spectrum disorder, and a whole lot of other things. Newer research around nutrition is saying that the synergistic effects of multiple things being planned to work together is a lot more effective than one thing working alone. You can get a lot of information about that on our website, or you can head over to Get Hardy, that's GETHARDY, and use offer code TAPROOT for 15% off. It would help them, it would help me, and it also would probably help you. One of the more frequent things that patients and people in the randomized controlled trials that Hardy conducted report is that they feel more themselves, more focused, and more effective at getting things done, which can result in all of us having a little bit more time.